Somewhere in a conversation, you probably wandered off in your head while everyone else stayed on topic. Someone was talking about marketing, and suddenly your brain jumped to biology, then to architecture, then to some half-formed idea connecting all three, and you had to physically stop yourself from derailing the whole conversation. If that sounds familiar, you're not distracted. You might just be wired like a polymath. And the strange thing about polymaths is that the world doesn't quite know what to do with them. Schools push specialization. Careers reward staying in one lane. Society hands out praise to the person who becomes the best at exactly one thing. And meanwhile, there's a type of mind that refuses to sit still inside a single subject, that gets restless the moment it fully understands something. Because understanding, for this kind of brain, isn't the finish line. It's the invitation to go find the next connection. Today, I want to walk you through what psychology actually says about how polymaths think, why their brains process the world so differently, and why, once you understand the mechanics behind it, you'll probably stop treating your own scattered curiosity as a flaw and start treating it as exactly what it is, a different and in many ways more powerful way of processing reality. Think of Leonardo da Vinci, painting the Mona Lisa in one sitting and designing flying machines and studying the flow of water in the next. That wasn't a man who couldn't focus. That was a mind that treated every field as one more piece of the same underlying pattern, and psychology now has a name for exactly how that kind of mind operates. The first thing that sets a polymath's mind apart is something psychologists call need for cognition, a well-documented trait describing how much a person genuinely enjoys effortful thinking. Most people, once they've solved a problem or learned a skill, feel satisfied and move on. A polymath feels something closer to hunger. The moment one subject stops presenting new mental resistance, the brain starts scanning for the next thing worth wrestling with. This isn't about attention span, and it isn't about discipline. It's about what generates dopamine for that brain. For most people, dopamine spikes come from completion, from finishing, from mastery settling into comfort. For a polymath, dopamine spikes come from the act of connecting, from that specific moment when two unrelated ideas suddenly click into place. And once you understand that, a lot of behavior that used to look like restlessness starts making a lot more sense. The second mechanism is something cognitive psychology calls divergent thinking, the ability to generate multiple, often unrelated, solutions or ideas from a single starting point instead of narrowing in on one linear answer. Most education systems are built almost entirely around the opposite skill, convergent thinking, taking a lot of information and funneling it down into one correct response. That's an essential skill, but it isn't the only one, and polymaths tend to have an unusually strong divergent engine running constantly in the background. Give a polymath one problem, and instead of one solution, you'll often get 4 or 5, pulled from completely different fields, stitched together in ways that surprise even the person doing the stitching. This is exactly why polymaths often struggle inside traditional academic or corporate structures that expect a single, tidy area of expertise. Forcing that structure onto them tends to produce frustration rather than performance. The third piece of the puzzle is something researchers call a broad associative network, essentially a mental map with an unusually high number of connections between distant, seemingly unrelated pieces of knowledge. Most specialized minds build deep, narrow networks, incredibly detailed inside one domain, but with very few bridges connecting to anything outside it. Polymaths build the opposite structure, wide, sprawling networks with far more bridges than deep tunnels. And this is precisely why a polymath can hear something about, say, ecosystems, and immediately draw a parallel to how a company should be structured, or hear something about music theory and suddenly understand a mathematical concept they were stuck on for weeks. It isn't magic. It's architecture, more cross-connections between distant categories of knowledge, so insight doesn't have to travel far to find a matching pattern elsewhere in the mind. The fourth trait, and one that often gets mistaken for a personality flaw, is a naturally lower tolerance for boredom once mastery starts to plateau. Psychologists refer to this as a heightened sensitivity to novelty. essentially a nervous system that responds strongly to new stimuli and starts to disengage once stimulation flattens out. This is often misread by teachers, employers, even by polymaths themselves, as an inability to commit, as flakiness, as a lack of follow-through. But that reading misses what's actually happening. A polymath isn't incapable of depth. They're simply wired to seek depth across a wider surface area, moving from mastery in one domain into curiosity in the next, rather than remaining permanently inside a single, narrow well. The fifth trait is a strong capacity for what's called transfer learning, taking a skill, mental model, or framework learned in one domain and successfully applying it somewhere completely different. This is arguably the single most valuable cognitive advantage a polymath carries into adulthood, because most real-world problems aren't neatly confined to one discipline. Business problems often need psychology, medical problems often need systems thinking. Creative problems often need a working understanding of logic and structure. A specialist, however brilliant, can sometimes hit a wall precisely because their expertise was built for one very specific terrain. A polymath, by contrast, tends to walk into unfamiliar problems already carrying 5 or 6 different mental toolkits, and often finds a solution precisely because they weren't limited to the standard toolkit everyone else in that field was trained to reach for. Now here's the part that rarely gets talked about honestly. This kind of mind comes with real costs. Polymaths frequently struggle with something researchers describe as identity diffusion, a difficulty answering the simple question, "What do you do?" because the honest answer involves 5 or 6 different things, and modern professional culture generally expects one clean label. This can create genuine anxiety, a sense of being perpetually behind specialists who've spent a decade going deep in one lane, while the polymath feels like they're just getting started in 5 different lanes at once. There's also a real risk of what's sometimes called shallow generalism, spreading attention so wide that nothing ever reaches the depth needed to actually matter. The difference between a polymath who thrives and one who burns out usually comes down to whether they eventually learn to manage their own breadth on purpose instead of getting pulled around by every new interest that shows up. There's also a subtler cost that rarely gets named directly, the loneliness of not finding many people who process the world the same way. Specialists tend to find their tribe fast, other people who speak the same narrow language, who nod at the same references, who understand instantly why a particular detail matters. Polymaths often sit in rooms full of specialists from 5 different fields and never quite find a room built for the specific way their mind moves across all 5 at once. That isolation is real, and it's one of the quieter reasons so many polymaths eventually build their own lane instead of trying to squeeze into someone else's. So if you recognize yourself in any of this, here's what actually helps, based on how successful polymaths structure their own minds over time. The first step is picking 2 or 3 core domains to return to consistently, not to trap your curiosity, but to give your breadth an anchor, because insight without any depth eventually runs out of material to connect. The second step is deliberately documenting your cross-domain connections the moment they happen, in a notebook, a notes app, anywhere, because those spontaneous insights are usually your actual competitive advantage, and they disappear fast if you don't capture them. The third step is giving yourself explicit permission to rotate interests without treating it as failure, understanding that finishing every single thing you start was never actually the goal, synthesis was. And the fourth step is learning to communicate your range in a way other people can actually digest, packaging what you do around the problems you solve, rather than around a single job title that was never built to hold someone like you in the first place. Polymaths aren't unfocused people who never figured out what they want to do. They're pattern seekers, wired by both nature and practice, to find the hidden architecture connecting things that look completely unrelated on the surface. And in a world that keeps getting more specialized, more siloed, more narrowly trained, that kind of mind isn't a disadvantage waiting to be fixed. It's exactly the kind of thinking that ends up solving the problems no specialist saw coming, because no specialist was standing close enough to 2 different fields at the same time to notice the connection in the first place. If this resonated with you, drop a comment below with the words "Wired to Connect." And if you want to keep exploring how the mind actually works, consider subscribing to the channel, because we're going to keep having this conversation right here. Thanks for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next video.